What happened to the franchise when Hasbro canceled the G.I. Joe A Real American Hero line in 1994? The animated series ended, and the Marvel Comics ARAH comic book series was canceled with issue 155. The toy line and many projects in development were shelved, and that's when the new iteration was born. Sergeant Savage and the Screaming Eagles rose up for their moment in the sun. Let's talk about them. First, thanks for watching JLS Comics. Hit that subscribe button so you can keep up with all of our weekly content, and with that out of the way, let's jump right into the story. Though the line ended, including all the planned Lunartix Empire aliens and replicators we talked about in that video, Hasbro wasn't done. Their relaunch, of sorts, was planned, and for that they brought in DC Comics Sergeant Rock co-creator Joe Kubert to help flesh out and bring to life a new iteration. There's a couple factors at play at this stage. Reader attrition was outpacing new readers who were turning to literal and metaphorical shiny new toys like Ninja Turtles, so a change was needed. A reset back to basics, if you will. Had the original line not been cancelled, this new line would have run alongside it as a companion series. That was retrospective reasoning. Another reason was prospective. In 1987, Warner Brothers planned on making a Sergeant Rock movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, with a couple early drafts of the screenplay being written and producer Joel Silver attached as well. In fact, Silver even handed out Sergeant Rock comic books to Arnold and the cast of 1987's Predator movie, and in between scenes they spent time on set reading those comic books. Milius did a script treatment in 93, followed by Brian Helgeland in 96. The 80s iteration of the script got far enough that Arnold told the Chicago Tribune in June of 1988 that they were going to start shooting in September of that year in Spain, but it stalled out and remained in development hell, though they remained serious about moving forward with the film. And like many things at the time, P&A and merchandising would have included a toy line, a license said to be awarded to toy maker Mattel. This would have put Mattel in direct competition with Hasbro, and so to get ahead of that, again forecasting market share, Hasbro brought in the Sergeant Rock co-creator, Joe Kubert, to bring Joe out of space and back to the foxholes. So when this phase of the conceptual, creative, and developmental process was complete, Hasbro launched the Sergeant Savage and the Screaming Eagles line, which turned out to be short-lived. Savage and his unit were meant to be a lead into a new line and an entirely new addition to the G.I. Joe franchise. The newly launched line also had an animated pilot episode released for a planned upcoming cartoon series, but that also never made it to air. A VHS copy of that single episode was, however, included with one of the many Sergeant Savage figures. But one of the factors that led to the Hasbro line being cancelled and the Marvel comic book series ending was, of course, waning sales. But one of the reasons for waning sales was that G.I. Joe had tended in the latter years toward more fantastical sci-fi concepts, and so Sergeant Savage was a reset back to the original ideas. Despite that and the ambitious plans for the line, it was cancelled relatively quickly and made way for another new iteration, which was 1995's G.I. Joe Extreme by Kenner, a toy maker who'd been purchased by Hasbro just a few years prior to this evolution. Why was this happening? Well, the Sergeant Savage line was a weird size with incompatible proportions to others, which made it hard to integrate into playtime with other Joes or even other figures. Plus, yeah, those samurai pizza cats, Ninja Turtles were hard to say no to, and with limited funds or begging your mom, you had to pick one. Sergeant Savage himself would make the jump from his line to the G.I. Joe Extreme line, which took place in 2009, which was the future at the time of production. By contrast, the 1994-1995 Sergeant Savage and Screaming Eagles began in the past, in the 1940s during World War II, and that is where we go next. Robert Stephen Savage is not from our time. Born in Albany, New York, he was alive in the 1940s when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Like many, this horrific event inspired a young Bob Savage to join the United States Army. Private Savage was deployed to the European theater during the war, where he fought Axis forces with a recon unit. One of their missions turned out to be a disaster, where they were ambushed by a German battalion and most of Savage's unit was killed. He managed to save 3 of his squad mates, carrying them 60 miles to safety, which parallels a very real-life story we'll talk about in a moment. This incredibly brave act, coupled with Savage's steely intestinal fortitude, led the U.S. Army to promote Private Savage to Master Sergeant and to build a special unit around him. Savage became a hero and a symbol of the war effort, used in propaganda for war bonds and to promote the Allied war effort. Though his image was used stateside and he could have parlayed that into a promotional gig safely behind the front lines, Savage used his new clout to take himself and his troops to some of the most dangerous fronts and battles in both the European and the Pacific theaters of World War II, working under the commands of people like Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. He was one of the troops who landed on Omaha Beach during D-Day. And at one point in the war, Commando Savage sunk a German U-boat by diving in and planting explosives on the hull of the vessel, UDT Frogman style. Based on the art, this was a U-boat U-7, which was a real sub that sank officially due to a malfunction during a diving maneuver. In G.I. Joe lore, it was Sergeant Savage's diving maneuver which caused the sinking. Savage also helped destroy the Guns of Navarone, which was a fictional campaign that was inspired by the very real Battle of Leros, Leros being a Greek island in the Aegean Sea. Savage said he was the toughest commander to ever step foot on the battlefield, leading his troops into combat with a pistol in one hand and a grenade launcher in the other. He was ruthless and brave on the ground, but not only was he a leader and heavy weapons expert on land, Sergeant Savage became a fighter pilot, flying a P-40 Warhawk and downing so many Luftwaffe planes that he became a World War II combat ace pilot. We also learned from the secret codes that Sergeant Savage's favorite foods are hamburgers, french fries, cola, and ice cream, which makes him truly American. In 1943, Cincinnati native 2nd LT Garrison Krieger joined. Krieger's code name was Blitz. It turns out that Blitz was a double agent secretly working for the German war machine and the Axis on his subforce, a parallel army called the Iron Army, his international robotic operations network. Sergeant Savage took on that Iron Army, unaware that one of their own was leading that enemy, sabotaging their efforts from within. On the Iron Stormtrooper file card, Sergeant Savage notes that these troops are like Sherman tanks with handheld howitzers. The modern-day Iron Stormtroopers, he notes, are actually enemy soldiers defrosted from the 1940s, but the difference is that 35% of their bodies were cybernetically enhanced, but that is surely unique to the action figure aspect of the line, because in the animated episode, Savage rips one apart with his hands, and we don't see any blood or bones. Sergeant Savage and his unit were sent to East Berlin on some intel about a top-secret laboratory bunker. That's when Blitz Krieger finally overtly betrayed Sergeant Savage and his unit, ambushing them with his robot stormtroopers in a ruthless attack. Savage's entire unit was killed in action, but Savage survived, though he was captured. Blitz, now called General Blitz, imprisoned Sergeant Savage, and Savage became an unwitting and unwilling test subject for genetic experimentation. His body chemistry was changed, and Savage was then frozen from 1944 until 1994. 50 years he was locked in that cryostasis chamber. No one found him, and Savage was believed to have made the ultimate sacrifice and posthumously awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor. 50 years later, in the modern era, Lady Jaye's G.I. Joe team in East Berlin uncovered a hidden World War II-era laboratory bunker, which is where they discovered the cryo chamber and the slumbering Savage within. As Hawk went to look at the chamber and talk about how to defrost Savage, Hawk commented that Savage was his hero as a kid, and he said this just as an Iron Trooper attacked and damaged the chamber itself. But this damage awakened Savage from his medically induced coma, and Savage was now awake in the 1990s, a true fish-out-of-water story paralleling that of Steve Rogers, Captain America. Doc ran some bioscans on Savage and noted a few things. The genetic manipulation made him stronger than a normal man. Doc also said he'd have to take a DNA recombinant compound to prevent the Methuselah effect. This means without the compound, Savage would age to an elderly state rapidly, and cellular degradation at that rate could kill him. Savage's power levels would fluctuate too, where sometimes he was essentially a superhuman, and so until Savage's condition stabilized, Hawk confined Sergeant Savage to base. And while on base, Savage began to suspect that Dr. Garrett Storm, who'd created the International Orbital Platform, dubbed IOSP, was actually his former second-in-command turned traitor, Garrison Blitz Krieger. He vowed that if this was confirmed, he'd defy Hawk's orders because nothing would stop him from avenging the death of his unit. On one file card, Savage is quoted as saying, "I'll track him down and hit him harder than DiMaggio blasts a baseball. Then I'll get mad." And on another he said, "He destroyed my platoon and my life, and I'm going to hit him 10 times harder than the attack on Enzio." And on the CRYO-FREEZE Sergeant Savage, he says, "When I get my hands on that treacherous traitor, he'll wish he had been frozen and locked in that chamber. In fact, that's not a bad idea." Which makes sense because while Sergeant Savage was able to pass through time without aging because he was frozen, General Blitz was able to benefit from the results of the genetic experimentation and continually de-age himself with his new biotechnology. Hawk then put Savage in charge of an unruly group of 6 sergeants. They had a lot of experience and expertise and skills among them, but more subordination and court-martial charges than Savage had years in cryosleep. Whipping them into shape would be the way that Hawk would keep Savage busy without him leaving base. This small unit couldn't follow orders, but the government had invested too much in them to cut them loose on discharge, so Savage was tasked with bringing them back in line, and Sergeant Savage trained them intensely, turning a junkyard into an obstacle course, which is when they found an old P-40 and fixed it up. This new team was dubbed the Screaming Eagles. This included a demolitions expert from Argentina named Hector Garrido, codenamed DYNAMITE. DYNAMITE's named after the artist who graded the iconic card, packaging, and box art for the G.I. Joe line, and who passed away in April of 2020 at 92 years old. The Screaming Eagles also included an artillery and hand-to-hand combat expert from Bayshore, New York, named David Bruey, codenamed D-Day, who was a former Golden Gloves boxing champion. There was also the mechanic Darren Filbert, codenamed Grill, the hacker Mouse, Kevin K, a comms expert who loved heavy metal, codenamed Headbanger. This unit also included the vehicle operator codenamed Tank, whose government name is Dwight Prudence, a clear nod to Dwight Eisenhower, the 24th President of the United States, but would have been Savage's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and head of Operation Overlord and D-Day operations. For equipment, they had their Grizzly Jeep and a P-40 Warhawk with weapons like motorized light and sound Gatling gun to bring to bear on their enemies. Savage wanted to take his new unit to attack Dr. Strom, but Hawk told him no. Savage and his team then hacked the head of the robot that had attacked Savage's cryo chamber and uncovered a plot to take over all the computer systems on Earth. When NASA launched the IOSP platform, this plan would come online and Earth would fall. We then learned that Blitz had aligned himself with Cobra Commander, but that a split had taken place, and General Blitz threatened Cobra Commander with destroying Cobra if he interfered with his plans as easily, Blitz says, as he helped create the Cobra organization. This was his time, after plotting in secrecy for 50 years, to step out of the shadows and take over the world. The Screaming Eagles then refitted and modernized the P-40 Warhawk they'd found, outfitting it with modern tech including autopilot, VTOL capabilities, and modern armaments. And so Sergeant Savage took this to fight against Krieger while the rest of the team rolled out with the new Grizzly and the overhauled Sherman M4A1 main battle tank. General Hawk was in the crowd at Krieger's launch ceremony when Savage buzzed the audience and strafed the launch complex. Krieger deployed his Iron Stormtroopers and the Iron Panther tanks just as Savage landed his P-40 and jumped out, his handheld Gatling gun ablaze, and then literally punched his fist through the Iron Troopers, ripping them apart with his bare hands. Savage then confronted Blitz Krieger while the launch countdown ticked down past the 3-minute mark. The rest of the Screaming Eagles took out the Iron Army while Savage and Blitz fought. Sergeant Savage then jumped on the rocket when it launched and was able to rip apart some wiring, making it short circuit and explode in midair. He used his watch remote control to fly the P-40 Warhawk up to him, and he jumped back into the cockpit just as the rocket and the orbital platform blew up in a massive fireball in the sky. At the end, Hawk said they definitely now had a new battle-ready combat unit. Lady J then came up to say that G.I. Joe's Skywatch had just detected a bogey moving away from the blast, and that was Krieger who'd managed to fly away and escape. Sergeant Savage later was with the Screaming Eagles on routing maneuvers above the Arctic Circle when they were attacked by a platoon of Iron Army Arctic Commando cyborgs. They managed to take them out with big help from D-Day and Dynamite, and Savage said next time they meet them, they'd kick their cans all the way to the South Pole. After this ended, Sergeant Savage made the jump to the G.I. Joe Extreme line. The G.I. Joe Extreme soldiers, led by Lieutenant Stone, perhaps another nod to Joe Kubert's Sergeant Rock, just like Sergeant Savage's, were tasked with taking on not Cobra and not the Iron Army, but another terrorist organization led by Count Von Ronny, aka Iron Claw, named SCAR, which stands for Soldiers of Chaos, Anarchy, and Ruin. Extreme included more figures, a comic book miniseries published by Dark Horse, who picked up the publishing rights after Marvel was done, and a 26-episode animated series where Savage was voiced by Michael Dobson that pushed the line into 1997. In the G.I. Joe Extreme continuity, Lieutenant Stone and Sergeant Savage had worked together before G.I. Joe Extreme was formed. In fact, it was their work together in counterterrorism and against SCAR that led a suit named Dr. Joseph Clancy to ask them to stand up a new counterterrorism team. They agreed to do this, and then Lieutenant Stone handpicked the rest of his team, which came to be the new iteration of G.I. Joe. In parts 1 and 2 of the G.I. Joe mini comic book, Sergeant Savage led the Screaming Eagles against General Blitz and the Iron Army, trying to protect an atomic plant that Blitz's army was assaulting. They jumped out of their bunker and shot all the Iron Stormtroopers, taking out the Iron Army's entire squadron. But Blitz was in his own bunker nearby, and hot lead and flying shrapnel zipped and whizzed and slammed into each side's bunker, and each side held their ground until General Blitz ordered an attack on the Screaming Eagles bunker. The Stormtroopers made it to the bunker, but it looked empty. Savage and the Screaming Eagles were hiding in the sand, making up the floor of the bunker, and they rose up, guns firing on full auto, and they sent General Blitz and his Iron Army blitzkrieging in the other direction, running away from the fight. In the Devil's Due G.I. Joe continuity, Sergeant Savage was called up from reserve status for World War III, deployed to Algeria during that time period, and actually made it to the group photo for America's Elite issue 25. And then in the IDW Hasbro continuity, Sergeant Savage first appeared in IDW's Revolutionaries issue 3, which revealed that back in the 40s, they discovered a link to Transformers Cybertron. They discovered a Transformer named Centurion and his ship, the Axelon. When Savage was helping fight the Iron Troopers who'd laid siege to the Axelon, it vanished to outside of space and time for 50 Earth years before returning to the timeline, and this, in this continuity, is how Sergeant Savage made it from the 1940s to the modern era. Also in this continuity, his World War II unit was the Screaming Eagles, which means that when they took on Grill, Darren Filbert, it made the Screaming Eagles the U.S. Army's first racially integrated unit. The first Sergeant Savage figure was released in 1999 1985, and this is the one that included the VHS copy of the animated episode, an episode where Scott McNeil provided the voice of Savage. Combat Sergeant Savage came with the Savage Cannon, a big old olive drab rocket launcher, among other equipment. Fighter Pilot Savage was boxed with the P-40 Warhawk CRYO-FREEZE Savage. Among his other weapons and gear, came with a water squirter pack and a cryo chamber, but not a real one, of course. Battle Command Savage came with a battle bunk and the first part of the mini comic book. Then in 1995, mail-away G.I. Joe Collectors Club exclusive color change Savage was the Desert Camo Savage. You could put him in warm water to change his color and then cool to bring him back. He was the Desert Combat Mission Leader and battled the Iron Army in Africa's Sahara Desert. There was also the 12-inch Savage in 95 called Total Combat Savage, which came with a big recoil action rifle and a bunch of other weapons and equipment. Others like Frogman Sergeant Savage and Air Force Sergeant Savage made it to the prototype stage but never made it into production. There was of course Iron Troopers, General Blitz, and there were more Savages as part of the Extreme line, such as the Power Punch action figure that was boxed with the Ultra Slam Firepower Detonator, Combat Cannon, and the Artillery and Ammo Specialist that added a junior to Sergeant Savage's name. As a fun aside, Marvel had a Captain Savage who led the Leatherneck Raiders during World War II, and in their first comic book they ran into Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. It was a S.H.I.E.L.D. and Nick Fury story called Fury Force that Larry Hama had repurposed to help create the original 3.75-inch G.I. Joe mythos, which gives this a sort of full circle element. There was a real-life Sergeant Savage as well, Sergeant Clyde Savage, who was a squad leader for 2nd Platoon, Company Bravo, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and who led his squad in the La Drang Valley against 2 companies of hostile forces. Clyde Savage saved the lives of 3 of his wounded comrades. Their platoon leader and platoon sergeant were mortally wounded, and so this Sergeant Savage took command, and under his command, they held off the enemy for 26 long hours before calling in artillery support, and with shells raining down close to their position, they held out through the night, with Savage killing dozens of enemies single-handedly before reinforcements finally got there to relieve them. It was an extraordinary act of courage and bravery, making him a real-life version of the Rock of Easy Company, the Fury of the Howling Commandos, and the Savage of the Screaming Eagles. And in the spirit of both Sergeant Savage and General Douglas MacArthur, old YouTubers never die, they just end their videos. And with that, that's a wrap on this, my friends. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and you'll be one of the first to know when I upload videos just like this every week. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.